Create a functional diagram of the cluster configuration which you intend to deploy. Start with a list of the nodes identified for the cluster. The node list may be created based on the port speeds and port density required for managing crossbox traffic volume. You can also start with a list of the equipment already present in the location but not yet clustered. Identify all elements and related information that would be needed for CLI configurations. 1. Provide the cluster name and ID for the cluster. A cluster name can include up to 64 characters, and the cluster ID can include up to 32 characters. 2. Determine the virtual IP address of the cluster that will be used to access the web or CLI cluster user interface. The master node will respond to that IP address. Note that the cluster name, cluster ID, and virtual IP address apply to the entire cluster, and all other parameters are specific to each node. 3. Provide appropriate names for each node and the maps in the cluster. Ensure that the names follow a proper naming convention with as much information in the node name up to 64 characters long. 4. All configurations rely on the nodes referred to in the commands issued through the CLI or web interface. 5. Identify the box IDs of the individual nodes within a cluster for configuration purposes. 6. Specify the preference numbers to influence the results of master and standby node elections. 7. Specify the node management port to identify which physical NIC should be used to access the production network. 8. Along with the port, identify the IP address setting in the production network, and that can be used in two ways. The master node uses this IP address to establish initial communications with the slave nodes while forming the cluster. The same IP address is used to establish web and CLI connections to each node. Note, after the cluster is formed, the slave nodes redirect web connections to the cluster virtual IP address. The CLI remains to be accessible just in case any system changes are required. It is a best practice to always use the cluster virtual IP address instead of actual node addresses unless you really mean to alter a system-level CLI configuration on a slave node. 9. Identify the clustering port in each node to specify the physical NIC to be used for sharing the cluster control database and configuration changes. If the cluster is using an out-of-bound configuration, then the node clustering port will almost always be ETH2 depending on the GigaView H series node or control card. 10. The node clustering port for out-of-bound configurations can be presented with either a static IP address specific for each node or use the Zero Config feature where addresses will be selected from the reserved RFC 3927 link local address range. Since link local addresses are not internet routable, they work well for private Layer 2 networks. If end-band clustering is configured, then the node clustering port will be the same as the management port, and both will use port ETH0. 11. Find out the initial crossbox traffic capacity requirements by assessing the traffic volume assessment for your environment. Based on these findings, specify the speed and the number of ports to be configured as stack ports. If the crossbox traffic volume exceeds the capacity of a single available link, then a GigaStream logical port group can be configured. Make a list of the exact port or ports used on each node for crossbox capacity.